In the next few lectures, we're going to take a closer look at pre-election polling. In particular, we're going to spend some time talking about the history of pre-election polls, including some historical polling disasters to help make the point that the science of polling continues to evolve. And we're also going to talk about some issues that pre-election pollsters face to help ensure that you'll be a more informed consumer of the many pre-election polls that you will see being discussed by the news media before this election cycle ends. We'll have 3 lectures worth of content, although I'm going to break them up into smaller bits to help them make them more digestible and hopefully memorable. I think this slide probably captures what many of you think about pre-election polls following the outcome of the 2016 presidential election. I know it captures what my parents, siblings, and friends thought. After all, nearly every single one texted me to ask whether I still had a job. Although we'll certainly dive into what the 2016 pre-election polls got right and wrong and why, in a few lectures, take a moment to look at the date in the cartoon. The cartoon is from 2008, but what pre-election polling eras can you even name from 2008? I know this is an unfair question. After all, many of you were only in elementary or middle school. However, the general point is that we seem to know that pre-election polls can make mistakes, but yet we cannot seem to stop talking about them. So why is that? To begin, let's start with a fact that I'm sure you already knew. The press talks about public opinion polls a lot. And by a lot, I mean more than they talk about nearly any other thing. Here are the results of a report by the Shorenstein Center at Harvard University on media coverage of the 2016 presidential election. While I hate pie charts, take my class on data science and politics for why, what you can see from the chart is that nearly 42% of the coverage was devoted to the horse race. Talking about who is up and who is down, talk that is made possible by the existence of pre-election polling, clearly dominates media coverage. You want to learn where a candidate stands on the issue? Good luck with that. Only 10% of media coverage was devoted to discussion of policy positions. Coverage dealing with leadership and experience, aspects that are plausibly important for deciding who should be the commander-in-chief of the most powerful nation on the planet, a paltry 3%. But talking about who is leading and who is trailing in the polls, well, that occupied a whopping 42% of media coverage. In fact, coverage of the horse race exceeded coverage of policy stands, personal traits, leadership, experience, and controversies combined. Precisely because the media coverage is so often driven by pre-election polls, it's absolutely essential that you be able to understand to help you know what to make of all that coverage. Although somewhat tautological, one reason why so much media attention is given to pre-election polling is because there's simply so many pre-election polls being done that can be talked about. Here's the number of pre-election polls that were conducted at a state level and publicly released in the last 2 weeks of either a primary or general election. While there's some variation based on the level of interest in the campaign, which is why there are so fewer primary polls in 2020 than 2016, for example, what you can clearly see is that there are lots and lots of polls to talk about. Even with a 24-hour news cycle, the fact that there were 220 pre-election polls released at the state level in the last 2 weeks prior to the 2016 presidential election meant that it was easily possible to spend as much time talking about what the polls did or did not reveal as the media desired. Moreover, these 220 pre-election polls ended up surveying nearly 230,000 voters in the last 2 weeks. Crazy. That said, while this sounds impressive, keep this number in mind when you visit pre-election polling in the 1936 election. So why is there so much demand for so many polls? Presumably these polls would not exist unless there was an audience for them. So why is the media so interested in pre-election horse race polling? One reason for the media's interest in pre-election polls is the fact that polls provide content that can change every single day. Moreover, the results can change for some states, but not others, and for only some voters. Whatever happens, there's a story to be written about why the polls may have changed or not. Just like it seems like we need to try to explain every wriggle of the stock market, pre-election polls provide a lot of things to talk about. Polls allow the media to treat politics as a sport by providing a new score that can change nearly every single day. Even better, the score can change in some states and among some voters. These changes, or even the lack of changes, allow an endless opportunities for claims about why the polls show what they show, as well as a limitless ability to speculate about how these results may yet change. How can a candidate fall behind or surge ahead? In which states? Among what voters? A little bit of data can lead to a lot of conversation that can fill in a lot of airtime or column space relatively cheaply. After all, these are just opinions, interpretations, and speculations. There's no real hard truth to investigate and try to track down. Moreover, as we've just seen, we are blessed, or perhaps cursed, with a lot of polling data. Here, for example, is the average of the popular vote for the 2016 presidential election. This is from Real Clear Politics, and what it shows you is what the average polling result is that supported President Trump and Secretary Clinton across time. Now, why we care about the popular vote, given that we elect presidents via electoral college, is a topic for a different day, but here you can see that even in a race in which Secretary Clinton led in the popular polls from the outset, there's still lots of wiggles to be talked about. Why did the race tighten in early August and then diverge in mid-August, only to tighten again in late September before diverging in late November before tightening again? This trend invites you, it almost begs you to put your punditry hat on to try to spin a story as to what's going on. And this is a relatively boring trend because one candidate is always leading in the popular vote. For a truly crazy race, think back to the 2016 Republican primary. While this seems like ages ago, especially given the support that President Trump currently enjoys among Republicans, here's a graph of the support that the various presidential candidates had as of November 2015 if we average across all the primary polls that have been conducted. So at this time, there's 212 primary polls conducted by 32 different pollsters. Think of the questions this raises. With only 32% support among Republican primary voters, what was going to happen once the primaries actually began? Was the outsider Donald J. Trump of The Apprentice fame really going to win the upcoming Republican primaries? Or would establishment Republicans consolidate around some other candidate? So many storylines, so much uncertainty. Of course, we know how the story ended. That said, we can forget that as of May 2016, President Trump was still only polling at 56.4% among Republican primary voters. We are also reminded that the support for the then second place candidate in November 2017, Ben Carson, was short-lived, and support for Cruz, Rubio, and Kasich all served at various points in the Republican primary to no avail. But if you're the head of a media company, and if you have lots of content produced and time to fill, the ability to easily and rather cheaply produce content around these numbers is irresistible. Moreover, unlike policy positions or personal histories, which do not really change over time, and which are also hard to make interesting or exciting to an easily distracted audience, the ability to treat politics like a sport because the nearly limitless number of comparisons and speculations is really hard to resist. Pre-election polls provide a seemingly straightforward metrics based on what would happen if the election were held today. These numbers in turn invite stories about why candidates are winning and losing and how that can change. Moreover, if you're watching what's going on, you need to turn in tomorrow to see what's changed. Did the gap grow or shrink? Where and among which voters? And why? The questions that pre-election polls raise are questions of which hours and hours and pages of content can be pretty easily produced. So the fact that pre-election polls create such compelling and ever-changing content is an important reason that media companies can use pre-election polls to help drive election coverage, explaining, interpreting, and speculating about what's going on in the race and how that may change creates content that not only is changing, but also is easy and straightforward to produce. A second reason why we see so much pre-election polling is because the demand to do pre-election polling by pollsters themselves. Most of the time, pollsters do polls on things where it's impossible to know whether they are right or wrong. Think, for example, about the whole field of marketing and product development. If you're trying to develop a new brand of toothpaste, exciting stuff I know, but someone's got to do it. How do you know if the survey you commission to try to figure out the market is well done or not? Any survey you do is going to give you some numbers, but the question you need to know before committing serious resources to the new product is whether the survey results are correct or not. This is exactly the situation that young George Gale found himself. Here's the cover of Time magazine before the 1948 election, more on that later, being featured an article about how he got into political polling and why he was motivated to do so to help sell his marketing skills. Pre-election polls are one of the few polls where 1, lots of media attention is given to polls and pollsters, and 2, we can determine who is right and who is wrong. So if you're a pollster, you can make a name for yourself through pre-election polling, for either good or ill, and you can use that fame then to help attract additional work. Companies interested in doing marketing work can easily determine which polling companies did a good job at predicting the presidential election, and this in turn creates a market for pollsters. Pollsters with new ideas can innovate and prove their worth on election day, a worth that may then help them attract clients interested in non-political work who think that the ability to predict a presidential election indicates an overall quality of polling in general. A similar reason exists for academic affiliated pollsters. How many of you heard about Quinnipiac College, or Marist College, or Emerson College? Polling geeks and pundits will know of these colleges because of the pre-election polls they have done. So whereas the University of Alabama is perhaps best known for its football team, Marist College is best known for its political polling. While some schools use sports to try to attract national attention, others choose pre-election polling as a much cheaper alternative to increase their visibility and publicity. The fact that pollsters must make their predictions known to receive attention from the media, and that we also know how the election ends, means that we can grade pollsters based on their overall accuracy. After all, this is one of the reasons why pollsters do polls. So here's an example of one such report card, this one produced by Nate Silver at 538.com. For all you fellow geeks and data nerds out there, you can actually download all the data from the 538.com GitHub site, and if you want to, you can go ahead and devise your own ranking system. Now, there's too much data information to explain on the slide, and the content is generally beyond the scope of this class, but I would point out that each pollster is given a grade based on how close their polling results match the final election outcome. Looking at the table, we can see that the most accurate polling seems to be done by Marist College, Survey USA, and Emerson College respectively. So for example, Survey USA at the very top row, they did 787 polls, and they were correct in 89% of those, receiving an overall grade of an A. That said, there are some real failures. Literal failures. An interesting side note is that one of the failing survey firms was also banned by 538 Research 2000 because they apparently just made up their 280 poll results. They didn't do a poll at all. They just put some numbers out there that kind of matched what the other polls were doing, and they were found out to be fraudulent when people dug in a little bit deeper. So because so much polling is being done, when pollsters do their own poll, they know what other pollsters have already found. So they can use this information when deciding how to adjust their own results. We'll talk more about this later, but in the extreme case, such as Research 2000, they just basically skipped the whole polling in general and just went right ahead to using other people's results. A third reason, and the best reason in my opinion, for the focus on pre-election polls is that they arguably provide a better understanding of what an election outcome may mean. This, for example, is what NBC News uses exit polls to help interpret the meaning of an election. So for example, here's the infamous butterfly ballot used in Palm Beach County during the 2000 presidential election that ultimately resulted in Bush versus Gore and President Bush being selected as president over Vice President Al Gore. Now, we can put questions aside about ballot design and how we can determine the effect of this horrific ballot design on the actual election outcome, but it bases the question about when someone votes for a candidate, how do we know what they mean? Because the meaning from a ballot is entirely unclear. So the votes on election day will tell us which candidate received the most votes, but it won't tell us why. Was President Trump elected because voters agree with his policy? Because they wanted an outsider to disrupt things? Because they liked his tan? Because they were voting against Secretary Clinton? It's simply impossible to know from the votes themselves. Pre-election surveys and exit polls, on the other hand, provide a limited ability to know what voters say they are thinking on election day. This is really important because although every candidate who wins claims they have a mandate for change, this is not always the case. A candidate may win only because they are disliked left. If so, this is certainly not a mandate and something that only a survey can reveal about what voters are thinking when they go in the ballot box and vote for a particular candidate. I know this is likely way too ancient history for you, but here's an excellent example of this. In 1994, the Republicans gained control of the House of Representatives for the first time since 1946. Almost no one saw this coming, and the election resulted in Representative Newt Gingrich from Georgia being elected as Speaker of the House. The Republicans' campaign in 1994 involved a contract with America that they promised to pass within 100 days if elected. Now, just as an aside, if you look on the podium there, you'll note that the slogan "Promises Made, Promises Kept" is the same slogan that President Trump is using in 2020. In any event, Republicans interpret the fact that they were elected to the House of Representatives as a mandate for the items in their contract and a justification to push boldly ahead with their agenda. However, according to public opinion polls taken right before the November 1994 election, that may be a little bit of an overreach. So here's a question, for example, asking the voters if they had heard or read anything about the Republican contract with America. You can see that this was taken on October 25th and 26th of 1994 of 1,000 people right before the election. And if we look at the results, the public had no idea. Only 22% of voters said they had heard or read anything about the contract. A percentage is actually probably higher than it actually is because of the reluctance of some voters to admit that they were unaware of what's going on. So this matters because whereas Republicans interpret their election to the House of Representatives as a mandate for a change and a mandate to enact their contract with America, only a small fraction of voters had ever even heard of it. Much less were probably aware of what the contract contained. Instead, it seems much more likely that voters were reacting against events of the first 2 years of President Bill Clinton's presidency and not a mandate for a change the Republicans were proposing. Only by asking questions can we understand and try to interpret what the vote that voters are casting may actually mean about what policies they support. Pre-election polls and exit polls provide one of the few ways we have of understanding what an election result may actually mean. Blowouts do not always necessarily imply that the public wants large change, and narrow victories don't always imply a lot of contentment with the status quo. Voters may cast their ballot for lots of reasons, and while a vote can tell us who a voter supports, it can't tell us why. But the question of why is absolutely essential for understanding and interpreting the meaning of an election and what the public is likely to support going forward. So while we often focus on who's up and who's down from pre-election polls, the real value of pre-election polling is it gives us a notion about what voters are thinking about in terms of the types of policy that they want to see enacted and the change that they want or don't want to observe in their country going forward after the election. So let's pull this all together. We see so many polls and we know the media spends so much time talking about them. Why is this? The first reason we talked about was demand. The news media likes pre-election polls because they provide an ever-changing story, an ability to explain what's going on, and also the fact that everything could be changing means that the audience has to tune in every single day to figure out what's going on. So there's a tremendous demand in the 24-hour news cycle that we exist in to have a content that, such as pre-election polls, that always begs to be explained, and the media can do so. But just as there's demand, there's also supply. Pollsters themselves love to provide the chance to say what's going on in the election, because it's one of the few opportunities they have to prove their worth against competitors and also receive public attention. If you're a pollster, this is one of the few times when you can end up on NBC News or CBS or CNN to talk about a poll. Most of the days you're talking about toothpaste or something that's less exciting, but presidential politics or election politics, this is your chance to shine and to use that notoriety and that fame to hopefully attract market attention. So these are all explanations, but I think the real reason is that they can help us understand why. An election will only tell us who wins and by how much, but it won't give us any real insights into why voters decided why they did. Polls and exit polls are one of the few ways that we have at our disposal for understanding what the outcome of the election may mean. And that's absolutely critical in any democracy for understanding what are the voters thinking about when they're making their decision. What basis are they deciding upon? Because that's going to help structure to understand whether or not the government's likely to overreach or underreach, depending on what the mood of the public is like. And so we can certainly see why polls exist, because the media loves them and why that's the case, and why pollsters like them. I think what's often lost is that polls actually do a valuable service for us, because they give us an opportunity to know something we would not otherwise know. Who's up and who's down, and whether Biden's leading Trump and in which states at this point, it's all silly in some sense, because we're going to know on election day. But what we won't know on election day without a poll is what the meaning of that election is. Why did the voters decide the way they did? And that's something that a ballot can't tell us, and only pre-election polls or exit polls can really give us an insights into what the electorate's thinking. And that's absolutely critical for understanding and interpreting elections and what they may mean for the future of our country.